Norman, and I am very excited, let me get this off my screen, to be able to welcome Dr. George Veni, caver extraordinaire, and I will not call him an adventurer, who is our guest speaker tonight. I won't call him an adventurer, but I'm going to tell you that Dr. Veni is a big deal in the karst world, and we're very honored to have him join us. He's actually in San Antonio right now after leading the National Caves and Karst Management Symposium held in San Marcos last week. The event was organized by the International Union of Speleology, which is a worldwide group of cave and karst explorers, scientists, and educators, a group that Dr. Veni has been president of since 2017. Although he doesn't live in Texas, he has spent a lot of time here and is an expert on the caves in Comal County. As an internationally recognized hydrogeologist specializing in caves and karst terrain, Dr. Veni has conducted karst research throughout the United States and in several other countries. He has served as a doctoral committee advisor for geological, geographical, and biological dissertations. He has taught all over the world. He has taught in universities oh, I've lost my page. I'm sorry. He's taught geoscience courses at the university level and teaches karst science and management workshops internationally for the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, where he serves as executive director. He's one busy man. He's published and presented nearly 270 papers and 6 books on hydrogeology, biology, and environmental management in karst terrains. Dr. Veni has agreed to spend some time answering questions at the end of this presentation, so jot your questions down and please plan to stick around for the Q&A part of the program. We are pleased to have you with us tonight, Dr. Veni. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I saw in the chat questions about the recording. Because I was made host of this, I'm the one, I had to record it, so I'm recording it on my computer, and then I'll share it. I'll have to send it by WeTransfer or something to, I assume I'll send it to Helen since I have her address, and she can share it with everyone else. So let me share my screen, and we can get started here. Oops, all right then. So can everyone see that? So,
yes.
All right, great. Just to introduce myself just a little bit further, up until about 15 years ago, the San Antonio area was home. And then a bunch of people apparently got badly inebriated and hired me to move to New Mexico and become the executive director of the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. But I still come back to the area about 2 to 3 times a year. Family, friends, various projects that I still conduct in the area, and I come back whenever I can. Additionally, I'm the president of the International Union of Speleology, which essentially is the United Nations of cave and karst research and exploration countries. We have 57 member countries currently around the world, and India may be joining us as our 58th. And for the most part, I'll be giving this talk based on my NCRI role, National Cave and Karst Research Institute, but the International Year of Caves and Karst is something that's organized through the International Union, which goes by the acronym UIS. So I'll be talking about some of the opportunities, the benefits that caves and karst offer us in focusing on Comal County, and some of the challenges that we have to deal with. But I'll start by talking about the International Year and just a little bit about one type of solution to some of the challenges that we deal with. When I wrap up, I will stay on as long as y'all want to talk and ask questions. This is a virtual meeting, but I do the same thing with in-person meetings. So if we were in some meeting room, I'd stay there until the owners of the meeting just chased us out. So anyway, let me here we go. Let me get my pointer. There's my laser pointer. There we go. And let's get going. So first of all, the key question that people ask is, what is karst? And karst is a type of terrain. It's formed primarily by dissolving away the bedrock, and the typical bedrocks that we deal with are limestone, dolomite, marble. And if you're in arid climates, you'll have gypsum and halite as karstifiable rocks. And halite is basically just rock salt. In super arid countries, Israel currently has the longest halite cave in the world. They took the record from Iran, which had it previously. Common features in karst areas are caves, sinkholes, underground streams, rivers, and large springs. The photo here shows a karst landscape in China. And so people will look at these mountains in the background, and they get they'll have this mental image of each of these mountains being individually pushed up by deep tectonic forces. But in fact, the whole region was uplifted. And then what happens is the ground is being dissolved away. So all these valleys are where the ground is literally being dissolved away, and the water then flows down into a channel, goes underground into a cave, and here we've got a natural bridge which is left over from an uncollapsed portion of the cave, and then the river continues and then goes underground for good underneath me in a cave entrance that's about 140 meters tall. So that's what, about 150, about 500 feet tall. So karst covers about 20% of the world's surface. In the United States, karst and something called pseudokarst, it's a related terrain, but not formed by dissolving of the bedrock, but similar features. Karst and pseudokarst cover about 25% of the United States. These are minimum numbers because this is based on the rock that's exposed at the surface. But in many places, the karstifiable rock is in the subsurface, buried under other rocks, but it's still of importance to what happens above because you can drill down into it to pump out water. So for example, the largest wells here in San Antonio are pumping water on the south side of town from the Edwards Aquifer, where the Edwards Aquifer is not exposed at the surface. Also in some parts, collapse can happen and cause great headaches and catastrophes by collapsing upward through non-karstifiable rocks up to the surface. So we don't really have a good number for what that is. That total number is worldwide. But it's certainly much larger than 20 or 25%. So knowing this, the US Congress in 1998 created NCRI, the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, and they gave us these mandates, these 6 mandates, which essentially are to conduct, support, facilitate cave and karst research, education, management, archiving of data, and to do this primarily nationally, but also to some degree internationally, and of course to develop collaborations that support all of these above goals. Now, what's the International Year of Caves and Karst? This is organized by the UIS, by the International Union of Speleology, and its goal is to educate the public, policymakers, land managers, educators, students, scientists, essentially the world, about the importance and some of the challenges that occur with caves and the karst areas in which many of them occur. It's the year of caves and karst, and NCRI is the Cave and Karst Research Institute because not all caves are karstic. Some of them form in other terrains that are very important, but generally speaking, the most common, the longest, the deepest, the most significant tend to be karstic. But again, there are many non-karstic caves that are highly important. The theme of the International Year is explore, understand, and protect. And this is simply because, especially when it comes to caves and karst, without exploration, you don't know what you have. And then once you know what you have, you can study it, you can research it to understand it. And with that understanding, then you can do proper and sustainable protection and management. So if you're interested in the International Year, I encourage you to look at the website, iyck2021.org. The International Year, because of COVID, is being extended through 2022. We won't change the logo or the web address there. But if you go to the website, this is the first thing you'll see. And this here is a movie. It's a 6.5-minute movie, brilliantly done by Uwe Kruger, a German cinematographer. And it explains concisely and just, again, beautifully what caves and karst are, why they're important, and why we're doing this International Year. So, so you can look at that. You can scroll on to some of the other tabs, and you'll find information about caves, biology, hydrology, archaeology, a whole lot of things going on there, a lot of great information. And I should, of course, plug my own institute, the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. Our website also has seen a major upgrade. And again, more information about caves and karst are there as well. So you're welcome to go check that site out too. We have events. Events that if you click on the events tab, you'll see things that are coming up. And in this case, event results, events that have already happened. COVID has been in some ways a good thing for the International Year, because talks like this one that I'm giving, traditionally I'd be in a room with 20, 30, 50, maybe 100 people at the most. And then when the talk is over, it's over, that's it. But people around the world now are doing these virtual lectures, these virtual webinars and programs and conferences, and the information is being preserved online. It's going onto our website. And so this website is the richest collection, video collection of cave and karst information, lectures anywhere. So if you want more information, just go click here, click on event results, and scroll through the months. And there's a lot of incredible stuff that you'll find. Of course, not all of it is in English. It is the International Year. But it's just a huge, rich library that we're really excited about having. If you want to get more involved, go to the download page. You'll find planning guides. You'll find a leaflet that you can print out and distribute, posters that you can print out and distribute. And you'll notice here that they are in different languages. So this is all available for free download, because, you know, we can't do it ourselves. The UIS Bureau, the governing board, we're just 12 people. 12 people can't reach the world. And so we really depend on our partners to come out and help. So as of today, we signed up a new partner organization. So we have currently 257 partner organizations from 50 countries, 349 events, and I'm counting this lecture being one of them, have been completed. 64 events are planned, and more than half of those events are actually multiple events, things that happen every month or every 2 weeks. So there's actually a lot more than just 64 events planned. We have 5 governmental proclamations that have been issued. And the one I'm holding here in this photo is from the governor of New Mexico, recognizing the International Year. And more things keep rolling in daily. Like I said, we just got a new partner today from Brazil. So conservatively, we've easily connected with over 40 million people around the world. At the end of the International Year, we're going to compile all this information and document this so that in a report, so that people can use this to get additional support, additional funding for legislation, for research, for additional exploration to help demonstrate the importance of this event. So the most significant ever event for caves occurred about a month and a half ago when we were in Paris at UNESCO headquarters. UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, invited us to celebrate the International Year at their headquarters. You know, the photos from here, if you go to the website, to the International Year website, and you click on the September events, you'll find a link. 3 hours and 20 minutes of great lectures and meetings and so forth about this. And so the reason I say this is the most significant ever event for caves in Karst is quite simply because we've never talked, the cave Karst community, we've never had an audience with a team of international heads of state, international governmental leaders, ambassadors. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And so after we finished, we went around the corner, and it's just off the photo here, a nice French cafe. And we justifiably patted ourselves on the backs for a job well done. And then I told my team, this is just the beginning. Because while this was an excellent meeting, it's really put a lot of enthusiasm into us and our partners. The next steps are more critical. We need to develop something concrete, something tangible from this. And so I'm going to share the next 3 slides are parts of my presentation to UNESCO. And while they focus on UNESCO, the message is actually broader, and you can put your organization and other organizations wherever it says UNESCO in terms of, and this is a little bit somewhat of the solutions that we're trying to develop toward to improve cave and karst protection. And so there were 3 things I asked them for, and I have to be careful. Because of the politics, we cannot make any requests. And so as you can see here, we encourage UNESCO, and we encourage them to develop inventories of all caves, karst features, and their contents in UNESCO protected areas. UNESCO protected areas include biosphere reserves, World Heritage Sites, global geoparks. We don't have any global geoparks in the US. Our national parks and our state parks tend to fill that gap somewhat. But again, rather than UNESCO protected areas, this could be Texas Parks and Wildlife protected areas. This could be US National Park protected areas. This could be any local or regional protected areas. But we need to develop these inventories, and this is resource management 101, but sometimes when people hear about karst, they get glassy-eyed. They feel overwhelmed that this is a complex subject, and it is, but the basics still hold. This cave here in Yucatan has these incensarios, these incense burners left by the Maya about 1,000 years ago. We wouldn't know about these unless we went into the cave. Unless we inventoried the cave, unless we looked into these things. And for example, this one is empty, but this one here, you can't see inside, has all sorts of materials inside of it. It's telling us a lot about what they did. And so these inventories are crucial. Now, the next thing was to suggest that UNESCO, and again, this applies to anyone dealing with protected areas, evaluate their protected areas based on these inventories to see if their protection measures are adequate for caves and karst, and then expand that protection as needed. Now, I told the UNESCO folks, I said that polluted caves occur everywhere around the world, and I'm showing an example from my country. Clearly, I was not going to show a polluted cave example from anyone else's country. That would definitely not be a good thing. But this is from when I was a grad student. Some of you will recognize the character here, Gary Schindel from the Edwards Aquifer Authority. This is when we were both young and studly. But Gary is standing in Lost River Cave. This is in Bowling Green, Kentucky. He's standing in water. The entrance of the cave, far off, about 1,000 meters off to the right, is currently protected. It's a nice park. But we went into this cave, and we saw passages like this one, and you see this black stuff here. We tested this, and what we found was that black stuff was a combination of oils, grease, sewage, and it tested positive for 14 carcinogenic chemicals in excess of safe drinking water standards. Now think about it. This cave stream is the aquifer. The cave stream is the aquifer. And over 14 carcinogenic chemicals in excess of drinking water standards. And they're coming out of this side passage. They're not coming from the protected area, off to the right. And so the only way we know this exists, and the only way we know that there's a problem somewhere, is by going inside and inventorying the cave. The meter that Gary's holding here was actually testing the air quality. And I mean, this cave was seriously polluted. And so it would tell us whether or not it was safe to proceed, or if we need to go out and get the spacesuits. So, so it shows some of the problems that occur in karst areas. Now, another thing that I asked and invited UNESCO and invite you and invite everyone to join the UIS in developing an international ban on the trade of cave materials. So this is from an Asian wholesale market, a photo I took a few years ago, where folks there went into caves and they harvested stalactites, stalagmites, sliced them and diced them here into nice discs. You see these rare cave pearl type formations. They're a cauliflower variant. Anything that large is incredibly rare. And anyway, they're selling them as decorations. I was thinking about sites. I expect many of you are familiar with it. It's something that the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, developed in 1963. CITE stands for the Convention on the International Trade on Endangered Species. And I thought, can't we do something similar for cave materials, to develop an international ban? And so this is the next big project for the UIS. And it's not just cave minerals, which are called speleothems, but cave animals. Bats, for example, are harvested out of caves for food, for indigenous medicines, and so forth. Sediments, bones, rocks, these are not sustainably harvestable from caves. And these speleothems that you see here, they hold an incredibly rich record of paleoclimate and other information about our Earth history that is essentially being lost and destroyed through this trade. So this is one of the projects that we're working on and just starting to work on. So, caves and karst of Texas. This map shows you a generalized view of some of the major karst regions in Texas. Each region has its own peculiarities, its own differences. I will just highlight a few of them for you. So if you go out to the Stockton Plateau, which is essentially the Edwards Plateau, but west of the Pecos, Sorcerer's Cave, the deepest cave in Texas, you'll find it there. The cave goes basically vertically down to an underground river, right in the middle of the desert. So, and the only place where this river can come up back to the surface is 40 miles away, straight line to the Rio Grande. So it's far longer than what we've been able to explore. Also, if you go about 20 miles east of Fort Stockton, just off of IH-10, you'll find Amazing Maze Cave. And the map kind of speaks to itself in terms of the name. So a very, very different type of cave than Sorcerer's is. Of course, if you're on IH-10, you should stop at Caverns of Sonora. Texas has some fabulous, incredibly wonderful show caves. But Caverns of Sonora is pretty much internationally recognized as the prettiest show cave on the planet. As one friend of mine said, if you happen to find yourself in North America, it's worth detouring by Caverns of Sonora. And I think we're all in North America. So anyway, great cave. But I'm going to focus here on where the star is and focus on Comal County. But before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about karst, because I'm going to start by talking about karst aquifers. So I need to explain what they are and how they form to give you a better sense of some of the issues involving them. So what happens in karst? Again, karst is a chemical process. Rainwater is naturally acidic. And so As it moves through the limestone, it slowly dissolves open the fractures and makes them a little bit larger. And then some of them become large enough that we call them conduits. A conduit, hydrologically speaking, is anything larger than your pinky finger, anything larger than about 1/4 of an inch in diameter, because a hole that size, geochemically, in terms of its ability to not filter contaminants, in terms of its flow patterns, it functions the same way as a large cave does. So a conduit, pinky finger size hole or larger, functions as a cave. So anyway, these fractures enlarge into conduits. Once conduits begin to form, they capture water from the surrounding area, because water is going to try to find the most efficient way to travel, the easiest way, rather than struggle down through a crack. It's going to move along this bedding plane to this conduit. And so with more water, the conduit enlarges faster, captures even more water. It enlarges at a self-accelerating rate. When the conduit becomes large enough for a person to enter, we call it a cave. So a cave is just a humanly enterable conduit. So how do karst aquifers work? Here's a cross-section of that. Of course, we start with a basic hydrologic cycle. Rain falls from the sky. It picks up carbon dioxide in the sky from just naturally occurring in the atmosphere to create a weak carbonic acid. When that rainwater hits the soil, because of plant respiration into the soil, a lot of CO2 is released there, a lot of carbon dioxide is released, so it picks up even more, acidifies the water even more, and so that water is even more effective at dissolving the rock. So water will move through along fractures. It will move through the very matrix of the rock. Some of these fractures will dissolve large enough to create bowl-shaped depressions that are designed to funnel water down to the water table. So these are what I call good sinkholes. They were created to recharge the aquifer. Then there are other sinkholes, which you might think of as bad sinkholes, which form where you have an underlying cavity and the roof caved in, which certainly causes distress for the people on the surface. But water can come in that way as well. If you have a non-karst area off to the side, water will run off this non-karstic rock and dissolve its way steeply downward. But there's a pattern that you see here, and that is above the water table, and this purple dotted line shows the water table. Above the water table, the direction is primarily downward. Water is trying to get its way down to the water table as quickly as possible. Once it's down at the water table, it loses that energy from gravity, and it flows horizontally off to a valley where there's a spring. Now, as the valley cuts deeper, the spring locations will be deeper as well. And so the valleys cut deeper so that it created an outlet to create an artesian spring where the water goes down to an even deeper level. It gets trapped below a confining rock unit, and it rises usually along faults and discharges that way. The Comal Springs there in New Braunfels are an excellent example of an artesian spring. As the valley cuts deeper still, we'll see, for example, that this passage up here that's abandoned was one time the original flow path for this water that's now at this level. But then as the valley cuts deeper, this passage here will be abandoned, and the artesian passage will become a gravity spring draining straight out to a valley. So we're talking about very complicated systems. People will ask me, how old is the water in this karst aquifer? Is it tens of thousands of years old, hundreds of years old, a few days or hours old? And the answer is yes, all of the above. It just depends which part of the system you're sampling. So I've been in caves, like the photo I showed with Gary Schindel a short while ago, where you're standing in water, I'm standing in water, and that water rushing around me may have just entered the aquifer a few days or weeks or even hours ago. Meanwhile, the water dripping on my head that's working its way through fractures or even the matrix, the pore spaces in the rock, that water may have entered the rock tens of thousands of years ago. So in terms of managing the system, understanding its chemistry, its flow path, and how contaminants may or may not move through that is, again, highly, highly complicated. So in essence, karst aquifers are the most complicated types of aquifers on the planet. So let's look at the karst aquifers, the major karst aquifers in Comal County. And we'll start with the Edwards Aquifer. There's a more updated map that the U.S. Geological Survey, Alan Clark with USGS, and actually I just had a good long visit with Alan today, that he developed. But I'm showing you this one just because it's a bit simpler. The other one has a lot of busy, excellent, important details, but I think just for general purposes, this is easier to grasp. So this blue-gray area is the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. This is where the Edwards limestone is exposed in the Balcones fault zone, and you can see some of the faults, these black lines going diagonally from southwest to northeast. I'll explain faults a little bit more in a moment. And so this is the Edwards Aquifer area within Comal County. The water primarily comes from the southwest. Much of the recharge happens in Bexar, but especially Medina, Uvalde counties, and flows in this direction. We have then some of the water, quite a bit of it, spilling out of the Comal Springs, the largest springs in Texas. We have a little bit of water also spilling out of the Waco Springs. And then there's still some water left in the aquifer that makes its way out of Comal County and over into Hayes and comes out of the San Marcos Springs over there. So if we want to look at recharge features, the recharge zone of the Edwards, this is fairly typical of what we see. My friend here is standing, Philip is standing in the cave entrance. It's not much bigger than his butt, just to give you quite literally, the size of the thing. And the area in red shows the surface drainage area that feeds into this. It's not very large. Texas is not known for very large sinkholes, very large surface drainage that goes into sinkholes. There are definitely exceptions to the rule. There are some that are quite large, but many of them are this size and feeding a lot of small sinkholes and caves. And the caves, as I pointed out in that diagram, are vertical. The water's trying to get down as quickly as possible. And this is in meters. So this is 40 meters, about 120, 130 feet down. And then it ends. And in the past, I'd hear people say, well, caves like this, they're not important. They end. Here's this map. They showed that the cave doesn't go anywhere. Well, just because a person can't squeeze through it, through the end, through the bottom of the cave, doesn't mean that water can't. And water does do it quite efficiently. The reason that so many of these caves end this way is that as the water's moving vertically, that gravity, there's energy to really carry the sediments that are washing in from the surface, shown on the left, to wash it and carry it all the way down. But once it reaches down near the water table, it loses that energy. And the water's going to move horizontally. And so there's not enough energy to carry that sediment away. So if you dig and dig and dig, and sometimes you may only dig for 5 minutes, in other cases, you might dig for 5 months, but eventually you'll find the horizontal continuation. And the fact that we go into these caves and we see sometimes water levels will rise and fall into these caves. We'll see the evidence of that. And the water, again, has no problem rising and falling. Water pouring into this readily sinks into these floors. So there's no problem with recharge. So again, just because people can't squeeze through doesn't mean the water has any problem. So let's move out of the Edwards. And again, this is an overview. I could spend all week talking about any one of these slides. And some of you who know me well have, no, I'm probably not lying to you. So in the light green that I've outlined here is the upper Glen Rose, which is also known as the upper Trinity Aquifer. Now, I've said this many times, I really hate the term Trinity Aquifer. And the reason is that as I'll point out as we proceed, Trinity refers to a group of rocks, and that's fair enough. They have some age relationship that's useful, but hydrologically, this group of rocks is quite distinct. And so when people say, well, this is how water moves through the Trinity, I say that's nonsense, because the water moves differently in different parts of the Trinity. In some places, it's moving very slowly, in some places, not at all, or almost not at all, in some places, incredibly rapidly. So I really don't like the term Trinity Aquifer. But the Trinity is divided into three groups: upper, middle, and lower. We won't talk about the lower. It's not exposed anywhere in Texas. You have to reach it by drilling. And so in the Trinity Aquifer, the upper Glen Rose is the only rock unit that makes up the upper Trinity. Now, the upper Glen Rose is oftentimes called the impermeable base of the Edwards Aquifer, because here where you have the Edwards, the Glen Rose, the upper Glen Rose is below this. And so you can see here in some valleys where you've got upper Glen Rose popping out. And the reason it's called the impermeable base is that you have some limestone beds, but you have extensive clay beds here as well. And the clay beds keep water from moving efficiently downward. And so this photo was taken on Highway 281, just north of Highway 46. And you can see that there's a hole here. And you say, wait a minute, George, you said this is impermeable. And I've been through some of these road cuts, and I've driven along them. I see holes like this. Well, these are somewhat misleading. What happens is the water moves through the limestone, it seeps on through, and then it washes out the clay. It's not dissolving it away. It washes out the clay, and these things go back only a meter or two or three, and they really have no true hydrologic significance. So generally speaking, the upper Glen Rose is not a good water producing unit. It does provide some water to domestic wells, but not enough really for community wells. Also, some of these units, especially some of the clay units in the upper Glen Rose, have gypsum, so it gives a sulfur taste to some of the water. However, Natural Bridge Caverns, just outside New Braunfels there, and if you haven't been, definitely go. Natural Bridge Caverns, which advertises itself quite correctly as the largest cave in Texas. By volume, it's the largest cave. Natural Bridge is in the upper Glen Rose. And that's because in parts of northern Bexar County, southeast Comal County, and a little bit of Medina County, you have something called the cavernous unit in the upper Glen Rose, and it's about 40 meters, about 120 feet thick. And that part of the upper Glen Rose is in fact quite cavernous. So there are exceptions to the rule in terms of the Glen Rose. And for a lot of things I'm talking about. So let's do a cross section. This cuts through the area from west to east. And so New Braunfels is right around here. The Edwards Aquifer is divided into a contributing zone, a recharge zone, and an artesian zone. Now, let me explain this. We have also something called the Edwards Trinity Aquifer, which is up on the Edwards Plateau. It doesn't occur in Comal County. You see the fringes of it in western Kendall County, just a little bit of it in western Bexar County. But you have to go into Kerr County to really start getting into that. But essentially, you have Edwards limestone here in orange. But here in this diagram, the blue rock you see here, both the darker blue and the lighter blue, are also Edwards limestone. So just keep in mind that these here are the same thing as this. Now, the brown rock here is the upper Glen Rose. And so what happens is water comes down through the Edwards Trinity. It can't easily flow through the Glen Rose, and so it pours out of a number of springs that support the base flow of the Guadalupe, the Medina, and many other rivers that run through the hill country. Some water will seep out of the Glen Rose as well, and then the land surface gets eroded downward, and you also see another unit, and it says Trinity Aquifer here, but I'm dividing things up. So this blue is the lower Glen Rose. The white here is the Hensel sand. We'll talk about that shortly. And then this brownish olive color is the Cow Creek limestone. The lower Glen Rose, Hensel, and the Cow Creek comprise what's known as the middle Trinity Aquifer. And then the lower Trinity is below this. So anyway, for the Edwards Aquifer itself, you have the contributing zone. Water flows off of this area, and then when it encounters the Edwards limestone again within the fault zone, then that water, that's the recharge zone where the water recharges, flows into the Edwards. Now, a fault, I said I would explain a fault. A fault is a crack. It's a crack in the ground, but there's been movement in that crack. So you can see how between each block here that the rock is displaced downward. And here's a big fault here where now these rock units are displaced way on down below. And these here are some impermeable rock units. And so this is the Artesian Zone. So in this area, the water wants to rise up to the surface, but it's blocked because of those rocks. So it finds faults in other places where it can spill on upward. So this is just gives you a cross section of the area. Now let's get back to the Upper Glen Rose. The work I mentioned that Alan Clark did, that he published in 2016, the new geological mapping of Comal County. He found something that I've been suspecting for quite some time, and he gave it rhyme and reason. I knew of caves like this one, and the entrance of this cave is in the creek bed. Water flows down this creek, down this entrance, drops about 30 feet into a large room, and then it goes a little bit further and further down, and then it pours down these small passages as these stream passages. And I suspected that there may be some sections of the Upper Glen Rose that are cavernous beyond what form natural bridge caverns over here. And in fact, Alan's mapping has shown that quite nicely. And we see it primarily in the Cibolo section of the Cibolo watershed portion of Comal County. We don't really see it too much in Kendall County. We don't see it further to the north very much, but mostly down here. So again, a few more complications in terms of understanding these water resources. So the Middle Trinity Aquifer, I'm going to break them up into the lower Glen Rose, and then I'll talk about the Cow Creek and Hensel. So the lower Glen Rose, I've outlined it here, focused only on Comal. Of course, it continues into Comal and into Blanco County, and it's this dark green area here that we see here. So the lower Glen Rose is, in fact, quite cavernous. It's one of the most cavernous units, one of the best karst aquifer units within the state of Texas. And the premier cave is Honey Creek Cave. Honey Creek is the longest cave in Texas, has over 20 miles, just over 33,000 meters of passage within it. Helen, when you were with me on the field trip last week, if we would have gone into that entrance, into the water, made a right turn, made a left turn, and then jumped in the water and swam about 100 meters, this is what you'd be seeing. Just a nice large passage filled with water flowing out toward the spring. And all of the passages shown here in blue, with one tiny exception, this little divot right here, all the passages are filled with water. Some of them large, some of them small, like this one. And this one's got quite a flow on it. If you get a close-up of the photo, you see that the water is actually building a little bit of a head on my friend's chin there. So let's talk more about complexities of karst aquifers. Oh, and this says Comal and Kendall. Honey Creek is the longest cave in Kendall County, even though it doesn't have an entrance there. So the county line runs somewhere right through here. So let's talk a little bit more about complexities, and it's important to understand how these things form. So Honey Creek Cave began to form about 1 million years ago, and it formed by capturing water from the Cibolo Creek area, taking it northeast, and discharging it over here to the Guadalupe River. Now, the current natural entrances don't go to the Guadalupe River because a tributary stream formed that truncated the cave. And so there's about 5,000 meters of cave here I think we found some bits and pieces of it. But now the water pours out of the entrance, the natural entrances, as we call them over here. So that's how the cave got its start. Also, the Guadalupe is important because when the Guadalupe was at a higher level, it lost water into the cave, routed it this way, and then on back to the river. It was a short circuit. It was, in fact, easier to route the water this way than to flow overland. But then as the river continued to cut deeper, it abandoned this flow through the cave. And so this is, largely inactive. There's a little bit of water from local sinkholes that flow into that. Now let's add even more complexity. Something you never see on the surface are groundwater divides. And this is talking about during normal flow conditions where the water flows downstream in two different directions. And you have this on the surface and in other caves during flood flows where the water rises and overflows, but during normal conditions, to have the water flow in two different directions is quite unusual. And yet we have this in 6 places in this cave. So as we're trying to understand how water moves through the system, it gets pretty complicated. And then the water that came in here from the Cibolo, this is now pirated back. It's not going out this way anymore, except during floods when it overflows and comes this way. This is now pirated back into the Cibolo Creek Basin, and it goes into the Edwards Aquifer. So that piracy is shown schematically here. It came from the Cibolo, went into the Guadalupe Basin, and now is back into the Cibolo, and then through faulting, this is going into the Edwards Aquifer. So again, complicated relationships. We've got interconnections between some of these aquifers. Add to some more complications. Under Cibolo Creek here, there are cave entrances in some places in the creek, in the lower Glen rows, where I believe, we haven't proven this yet, but I believe during floods, some of the water comes out of other cave entrances and then sinks again later on, but mostly stays under Cibolo Creek. We also see the same thing here, and this is where 281 crosses Cibolo Creek. And so here we're in the upper Glen rows, in one of those funky units that Alan Clark helped clarify with his mapping, and we see a lot of maize up in this upper level here, and it gets down to a lower level stream, and again just comes from one side to the other side of Cibolo Creek. And then for yet another piracy, let's go back to our friends at Natural Bridge Caverns. There's the Natural Bridge. And the way this cave formed is water was lost in Cibolo Creek, went through the upper Glen rows in Natural Bridge, and then beyond the tourist trail, beyond the current level of exploration, it goes into the Edwards Aquifer. So again, complicated systems. And as I was saying with UNESCO, you need to go inside these things. You need to inventory them. You need to study them, because you would not understand these flow paths. They're not intuitive at all from the surface. You need to go and see and map them to really understand and properly manage them. So the last part of the major aquifers and part of the Trinity, the middle Trinity, is the Hensel Sand and the Cow Creek. Now the Hensel Sand is not a karst aquifer. The Hensel Sand is below the lower Glen rows, but above the Cow Creek. It's a sandstone. Its water moves in a uniform, predictable manner through sandstones. But in limestone, like the Cow Creek limestone, the flow paths are quite convoluted. And so we see the Hensel and the Cow Creek only exposed in this area. We also see the Hensel exposed up around the Fredericksburg area. And that's the major recharge area for these aquifers. The Hensels is exposed there. The water moves through the sand into the Cow Creek, and it moves generally down to the southeast in this area. But we also get some flow into the Cow Creek across faults where it goes into the lower Glen rows and then crosses in. The Hensel sand also changes from a sand to a shale, which is a clay type formation. It's poorly permeable, and that happens right here around the Guadalupe River. And so by the time you get into Bear County, Comal County, it's known as the Bear Shale, and it's really no longer a water producing unit. So again, when people talk about the Trinity, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the Hensel sand, where it's a good aquifer? Or are you talking about the Bear Shale, which is considered part of the Trinity, and it's essentially non-water producing? So we do know of some caves, of course, in the Cow Creek. This is not the longest, but in terms of volume, the largest cave that's known. And I believe this may be the original entrance for Honey Creek Cave over to the Guadalupe River. And inside that cave, you've got Cow Creek limestone here. We've got a fault through here. And right here, we've got the Hensel above it as a sand. So this is the only place I've seen in a cave, the Hensel and the Cow Creek together in one cave. So again, getting underground is quite valuable. As a hydrogeologist, going into these caves, studying their geometry, mapping these caves is teaching me a lot about the permeability structure of these aquifers and how they operate. So let's change focus now. Following that introduction, let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we have. Groundwater availability. Some of you will remember, if not through personal experience, at least through the record, that the Comal Springs, and this is Spring Run 3, nearly went dry during the drought of record in the 1950s. Groundwater availability is a big problem and a growing problem in many karst areas. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Now, the Comal Springs are, of course, fed by the Edwards Aquifer, but in 2000, Bob Mason and others from the Texas Water Development Board put out a report that had these two maps. The map here in the upper left predicts water use of the middle Trinity. So we're talking about the Glen Rose, the lower Glen Rose and the Cow Creek, which is really important. Those units are very important for the ranches. They're important for Bernie, for those communities out there. It shows that with predicted growth and water demand on the area, there's going to be a significant drawdown in parts of southwestern Comal and southern Kendall and northern Bear County. The red area you see on this map essentially shows that the rock is dewatered. All the water has been pretty much pulled out. And then you can see some drawdowns in other parts of the region as well. The map on the right says, well, what if we have a repeat of the drought of record that really dried things up here? And if we have a repeat, then you see a much larger red area and much larger impact as well through these throughout the region. So we've already seen, and this was back in 92, I believe it was, or so, the city of Blanco. They went dry for a little bit. The Blanco River went dry, again, because of groundwater usage. So one of the problems that we have in karst is that you can produce a lot of water in a karst aquifer. In, what was it, 1992, I think it was, the Catfish Farm well in South Bear County was put in. And it erupted geyser-like, spewing water 10 meters into the air until they finally were able to cap it and restrict its flow. Well, what happened in that case? They drilled way on down. I forget now, I think they went down about 900 to 1,000 feet or so, and they hit an 8-foot tall cavity. They did not hit this cavity. This is from Honey Creek Cave, but it's about the same height as what they hit there. We don't know how wide that cavity was, but we do know that it moved a whole lot of water. So what happens many times in karst is people will drill into a cave like this. They'll put their water in here and they think, I've got the mother lode. I can pull out as much water as I want. As big a pump as I can put in, this source of, this aquifer will yield that water. And so what happens is they pump as much as they can, but they're not pumping as much as is sustainable. And there's that mistake that's made, that disconnect. They're not thinking about what the sustainable yield is. And so, unfortunately, karst aquifers have a tendency to be overdrawn. Now with the Edwards, we've got a different situation. Also in the 1990s, the early 90s, we had this big lawsuit where the Sierra Club filed suit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the endangered species living at the Comal and San Marcos Springs, saying that you guys aren't doing enough to protect those springs because the water, the aquifer is being pumped, and we've got big cities like San Antonio and growth around the San Antonio-Austin corridor in Comal and Hays County that are withdrawing water. What's going to happen? It was really, in my view, a waste of money when many folks fought against that lawsuit, because Fish and Wildlife was the first one to say, yep, you're right, we're not doing enough. We don't have the resources. But after the lawsuit, they were mandated to do more and to develop those resources to protect the aquifer. So in theory, the Edwards should be okay, but we'll see what happens. A lot can happen as time goes on. Another big challenge when it comes to karst is groundwater vulnerability. So this is a map done by a student at UTSA a few years ago, and his professor, Youngli Gao. Having lunch with Youngli tomorrow. But anyway, and you see a lot of red here. So you don't see, down here we've got all this blue, and well, that's off the karst. Some of these green areas, and this is kind of the New Braunfels area, down around here. And this extends, this is a Cibolo Creek watershed that comes up from just below the recharge zone. So it includes Bexar County, Comal, and then over here is Kendall. And so we see a lot of red. And so people have looked at this map and say, really? Is it really that vulnerable? I've made the point many times over the years that I don't like vulnerability mapping in karst. And the reason is because if it's karst, it's all vulnerable. That's what the international scientific research community has found. And so sometimes people will look at these vulnerability classes, high, very high, high, moderate, low, and this is better. This classification scheme is better than some others because sometimes people say, well, moderate, well, maybe it's okay to build there or to conduct certain activities there, that there will not be an impact. But if it's karst, it's all vulnerable. In this case, the low and very low are not karst. So I agree with those. Let's look at the vulnerability though in a bit more detail. Now I'm switching out of Comal County down to Bexar County. Before I moved away, I was doing some research for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And so just to orient you, this line here is Loop 1604 over there. This is Highway 281 up this way. Camp Bullis is over here. Stone Oak Development is over here. Blanco Road goes right up this way. So what we did was, we did a series of dye traces. That's where you put in a non-toxic dye into a cave or or other recharge feature and see where it goes to. According to the computer models, and let me point out that this is about a 7-mile area, 7 square miles, east, west, north, south, something like that, 7-8 miles. You can see very detailed mapping of faults. There were close to about 100, as I recall, wells here that we were able to use for groundwater and other controls to really predict what's going to happen accurately. The blue lines show what the computer model predicted where the water would flow, and it said it would go to the east and to the southeast. These more colorful lines here show, nope, it went due south. So even with all of this detailed mapping and well control, the computers were wrong. You know, Karst doesn't lend itself to easy modeling. Now, one of these traces I really want to point out. It says interstream area. Now, all of these other sites, cave, pit, cave, cave, cave. All right, these are obvious sensitive recharge points, but interstream area, what we did, we took a spot where it was flat ground, no cave, no sinkholes, no recharge feature, just soil, much like you'd see anywhere. It's the sort of place that, based on the current geologic assessment methods, you could quite easily get justification for, let's say, a gas station on top of this. And so we dug down into the soil about 10 centimeters and about 1 meter square. And we took a hose and ran it down there and put some dye there, you'll see in green. So we only dug this to hold water. We didn't want it on completely flat ground and have the dye going all over the place. So it was just meant to hold the dye in one spot. And then we let the hose run. That hose ran for 1 month. The rough volume of this hole is 20, 30 gallons capacity, something like that. In that 1 month period, we put in nearly 29,000 gallons of water. It never overflowed. And in fact, the dye showed up 2 miles away down in the well here. And this was during drought conditions, I'll point out, when groundwater is moving very slowly, and yet we found it 2 miles away in a well. So imagine if this wasn't dye, non-toxic dye. I mean, these dyes are used in foods and medicines, cosmetics. So I mean, these are really very safe materials that we were using. But imagine if this was gasoline from a gas station that was here, just slowly dribbling away, leaking its load. Those are the sorts of things that keep me awake at night and concern me greatly. So let's follow up with that a little bit. In January of 2000, there was a spill at a quarry of about 2,600 gallons of diesel fuel. The Edwards Aquifer Authority went out and did some sampling. They weren't able to sample for diesel, but one of the breakdown products of diesel is naphthalene. And what happened, again, pay attention to the date here, the 14th and through the 16th of January. And yet by the 20th of January, the 25th of January, was this the 21st or the 22nd of January, naphthalene started to show up at the Comal Springs and at the Waco Springs. Was it from the diesel site? No one can say absolutely for sure. It seems an odd coincidence. You know, there's other potential leaks that could have occurred that could contribute to this. That's one of the good things about dye tracing, is that, you know, you put it in, it's very distinguishable. And if you don't believe it, you can repeat the test. It's empirical data. You can repeat as many times as you want, and you'll keep getting the results. Obviously, we don't want to repeat a diesel spill multiple times, but this suggests, you know, that, you know, perhaps that spill did go to these springs. So, so there's concerns about the growth of new bronchioles onto the recharge zone, which is shown here in green, and not just New Braunfels, but San Antonio and, you know, San Marcos and other communities onto the recharge zone, and all of the suburban and exurban growth that's occurring throughout this region. So one of the other challenges deal with karst ecosystems. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lawsuit that that was filed, and it's funny, when I drive back to Carlsbad, and I drive through Pecos, Texas. The county courthouse is named for Lucius Bunting, who was the federal judge who adjudicated this case against the Sierra Club about the endangered species. But yeah, it's a challenge trying to manage these systems for these species. But I also see these things as opportunities. So this is one of the listed species at the Comal Springs, the Comal Diopid beetle. It's an aquatic beetle. It looks like it's on dry land, but it lives underwater. An aquatic beetle that lives in this area and found pretty much nowhere else. But there are some benefits as well that we can gain. So let's look at some other species, though. Many of you are probably aware that there are a group of endangered cave species, not aquatic species. They live in dry caves in the Austin area and in the San Antonio area. Now, I developed the original maps looking at the distribution and the likely distribution of these species for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service way back when. They recently contracted NICRI to update the map for the Austin area. So the red area that you see here around Austin, just south of the Colorado, there's a dot there in red, up into the Georgetown, Round Rock area. That's where the endangered species are known to occur. As you move outward from those areas, there's less and less chance of those species occurring. When you get down here to Comal County, the blue area says, nope, this is a completely different group of animals. Those species do not occur here. Meanwhile, in Bexar County, I developed maps for those areas, for that area, and the species basically don't seem to go past Cibolo Creek. So none of those endangered cave species seem to be coming into Comal County. But last week, during my introduction, there was mention of the National Cave and Karst Management Symposium, and a couple of people asked me a question, and they say, "Well, why don't we have endangered species living in Comal and Hays counties?" And I said, "Well, really, what happened was in the 80s, early 90s." People saw the growth of Austin and San Antonio. They saw that learned that there were some species that were highly limited in terms of their distribution, which makes them more vulnerable to impact. And so they filed for listing. That doesn't, and so right now, no one has filed for listing. I'm not suggesting that someone does that, but it's something that someone may potentially do if they look at this area and say, well, wait a minute, what species are in this area, and only limited to a small area that's being impacted. And so that's what U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looks at. Not that a species has a limited distribution, but there's an actual threat to the species. So at this point, there is no threat. And yet another comment that was made during one of the talks at the symposium was, well, it seems that the endangered cave species, and they were talking about the Austin area, but the same applies to Bexar County, to San Antonio. They said, it seems that the Endangered Species Act was used to protect the aquifer in a way that the Texas state water laws weren't able to do. And I agree with that completely, because in the work I did as a consultant here for 20 years, I found far more stringent and more rigorous research and protection for endangered species than to protect the human species, than to protect their own water supply. And coincidentally, it's, many of these species lived over the recharge zone for the human drinking water supply, for the Edwards Aquifer, and so the humans benefited from that. So what I would hope is, if species get listed or not get listed, I would hope that people would recognize the value of protecting these ecosystems, because it benefits us in the long run. So, quit arguing about the species, they're protecting us too. Now, some of the karst benefits. This is the entrance to Bracken Cave. And if you haven't been there, you should definitely go. It's an amazing experience, because Bracken holds the world's largest population of bats. It's the number of bats in the cave are between 15 to 20 million bats during the peak. Essentially, you have between 7 or 8 million, 7 to 10 million, I should say, pregnant Mexican free-tail moms flying up from Mexico in the spring. They gave birth to an average 1 pup each. And so by the summer, the population has doubled to 15 to 20 million. And then you have these amazing, act of nature as you see the bats fly out of the cave. It's just a stunning sight to watch them fly out. It's like there's a giant bat machine and they just keep cranking and cranking and cranking these things out. When they go out to feed, if I remember the number correctly, the bats from this cave alone eat about 140, 150 tons of insect each night. Many of these are agricultural pests. Some people will say, well, this is great, they're eating mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are like potato chips. Yeah, if you're hungry, you'll eat a potato chip. But if you're really hungry, you're going to go after a big juicy steak, and so what they go after primarily are moths, which are agricultural pests. And so bats in the United States save American agriculture on average $23 billion a year in pesticides that are not applied to crops. And so that isn't even counting the benefit of not having those chemicals in our environment, in our bodies, in our foods. Additionally, bats worldwide are directly or indirectly responsible for over 450 different foods, medicines, and industrial products. Again, like so many other things I'm talking about here, I could talk to you hours about bats, but I just don't have the time. But I will talk to you a little bit about Bracken Cave in some more detail. So this is going inside the cave and looking at some of the research that that NICRI has done in the cave. I'm down here setting up this electrical resistivity equipment. A few years ago, Bat Conservation International, BCI, which owns the cave, they were offered an opportunity to drill in the cave and pull out a core of bat guano that they could study for paleoenvironmental, paleoclimatic studies and really understand what was going on here in the past. The question was, where to drill? Clearly, you see that there's piles of rocks here and some piles of rocks here falling from the ceiling. Undoubtedly, there's going to be more buried in the guano. How deep is the guano? How deep? Where's the best place? And so, so we did a number of lines. This is our first line. You can see the cable being laid out. I'm setting up the equipment. We're getting ready for a second line. A third line was hidden around this corner. We've done a total of 7 lines so far. And if all goes well, we'll be back in February to do, or January to do the 8th and final line. But this is what we got so far. And what it looks like is that the guano may be as much as 30 meters deep, 100 feet deep. But this is based on interpreting these signals. This part of the resistivity profile is in the cave. This part is the sinkhole entrance, and this part is here on the surface. So it looks like we've got about 100 feet, 30 meters of guano. But recently I was re-looking at, taking a closer look at the data, and I'm not quite sure. I think the guano may be shallower, and I may be misinterpreting some things based on some of that recent mapping that I mentioned earlier that Alan Clark has done. So I need to go back and reinterpret. But anyway, at some point though, unfortunately that drilling offer fell through, but at some point I'm hoping to get back in here and put in a core and really find out for sure and get a lot of great data about what happened in this region, thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps longer in the past. So there are many ways of dealing with some of the problems that we have in karst aquifers. The key, most important thing is drainage basin management. I don't have time to talk about all of the possible solutions, and I haven't talked about all the possible problems. But in general, it is the best major solution to karst challenges. And why? Well, let's start here. I'm jumping over next door to Kendall County. This is the map of Cave-a-thon-a-name. This little section here is the tour section, and the rest is a stream passage that comes around and then flows out to a creek. And so the black line shows approximately, based on some data I have, what may be the drainage basin for that cave. So why care about the drainage basin? Well, we recognize that all karst is sensitive and not just certain features. So it covers all that area. Now we can't go and manage every little feature, but we can look at total water use and total pollutant loading to say, well, let me back up just for a second. I know San Antonio and I believe, I'm not sure about New Braunfels, but some years ago I was working with San Marcos on this, but there are some ordinances looking at impervious cover within an area and trying to limit impervious cover as a way of limiting the pollutant loading. And so if we know we've got X amount of impervious cover, within the drainage basin, we can say, all right, we've reached the limit, no more. One of the ways that the pollutant loading is mishandled with those impervious cover limits is that they look at each piece of land and aren't looking at the totality of the drainage basin, and the totality needs to be looked at, because otherwise, if you're looking at each piece and thinking about all this and forgetting about all the stuff that's already developed and already covered with impervious cover, you may easily exceed your pollutant loading capability. Drainage basins are also the most manageable and effective for sustainable use. Drainage basins, in many cases, define or are related to regulatory authorities. They're often defined or related to economic and cultural needs. And they also often define the boundaries of karst ecosystems. So for example, if you've got some aquatic species living here, it's going to likely be restricted to this drainage basin and not to the one over here. So protecting land over here isn't going to help this guy. And if there are no listed species here or species of any concern, then this may be a better place to build or conduct the activity as opposed to this area. So, this is why drainage basins are really a good solution to many karst challenges. So again, this is a very broad brush answer to how to deal with some of these issues. So in summary, I think it's important to summarize some of the karst benefits that we see. So just going down the list, about 20%, some of these I'll repeat from earlier, about 20% of the world's land surface is karst. Karst and pseudokarst are about 25% of the US. And think about it, it's a terrain. People don't understand this. It's a terrain, a landscape, much like beaches and mountains are a landscape, but people don't understand karst. 10%, about 700 million people of the world's population depend on karst aquifers as their sole or primary water supply. And this includes the Central Texas region. It includes the Edwards Aquifer region, the Edwards Plateau region. Karst aquifers are the most easily contaminated. And while they can be highly productive in terms of putting out a lot of water, they can also be the most easily depleted. I haven't talked about sinkhole collapse, but sinkholes in the US result in over $300 million a year in road damage alone. Now, and that's a minimum number because of the way it was developed. Not all state highway departments really, and this was based on state highway data, not all state highway departments really calculate sinkhole damage. They just lump it into other maintenance. But when you include the damage to homes, business, properties, and potential loss of life, I think that that number easily exceeds over $1 billion each year. But it's unrecognized. It's a quiet crisis because you've got a sinkhole here in one spot, and let's say you have a sinkhole in the Braunfels. the county comes in, or the city comes in, cost them $5,000-$10,000 to fix, doesn't even make the newspapers. You know, you have another one that occurs maybe in Missouri. Yeah, again, the county fixes it, about $20,000, no big deal. You have another one that occurs in New Mexico, in Florida, whatever. Most of these things don't make the newspapers. If you took that $1 billion worth of damage and destruction and put it in one place in one time, it would be equivalent to a catastrophic flood or a hurricane or whatever. But because it's spread out, we don't really see and aren't aware of the total impact. We just tend to see and hear about like some of the more newsworthy sinkholes in Florida, where you can see homes and businesses, disappear down these holes. We don't have sinkholes like that very often in Texas, but they do occur. 2 years ago, in just north of Austin, there was a sinkhole that opened up in a subdivision in the middle of the road. It's amazing that no one drove into it in the middle of the night. And luckily, people noticed that their water was off because of the water loss, and they quickly barricaded, called emergency response, and took care of that. So they do happen in Texas as well, just not as often. Karst regions are among the most biodiverse on the planet. And this is for the ecosystems, not just above the surface, but also below. As I mentioned a short while ago, bats directly and indirectly help produce over 450 foods, medicines, and industrial products, and they save American agriculture about $23 billion a year in pesticides that are not applied. We haven't had time to talk about cave microbes, but there's a lot of work being done on cave microbes, and they're holding great potential for medical and industrial use. Haven't had time to talk about archaeology. Many of the world's most important archaeological sites occur in caves. And we mentioned this briefly about the scientific data coming out of caves, especially for paleoclimates. But NASA is studying caves as a means to look for life on other planets, and in fact, as a way to settle other planets. If we go up to Mars or to the moon, we're not hauling tons of iron and concrete up there to build structures. Those things are going to have to be mined locally. But we know of about 300 cave entrances on the moon and about 1,400 cave entrances on Mars that are visible through satellites, revolving, around Mars right now. So they're looking at maybe the first habitations being inside some of these caves. And economics. Show caves are visited by nearly 150 million people each year. This is based on an estimate a couple of years ago. I suspect it's an underestimate based on some other information I have, but 150 million people each year. And they boost local tourism and economies in dozens and dozens of countries. In Comal County, you have Natural Ridge Caverns. It is one of the most visited show caves in the country. I don't have the exact numbers, but I believe their visitation is somewhere around 400 to 500,000 people a year. Now think about that. If the average person coming in is spending, let's say $100. Now that's the cost, that includes the cost of the tour. They may have gotten something to eat, gassed up at the gas station, spend the night at the hotel, all these factors come in. So if we just say $100, souvenir shopping, not just at the cave, but elsewhere in the county. So, $100 times 500,000 people. What is that? That's 50 million. What are my numbers? Yeah, that's $50 million a year brought in just from that one operation. So, so they can be incredibly important for economies. So if you want to learn more, certainly these are places to go to and to get more information. The Edwards Aquifer Authority, Texas Water Development Board has many publications. So does the Bureau of Economic Geology and the U.S. Geological Survey. Many of these things will be more technical publications, but you can certainly go also to the website of the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. which has things designed more for the general public, although a lot of it won't be specific to the Comal County area. You can go to the Karst information portal. This is a NICRI project that we've developed with other partners, which is an online library of free publications from around the world. Last year we had, I think, like 330,000 downloads of reports from around the world. And of course, it's the International Year of Caves and Karst. So you can find information on that website, and please, if you want to conduct any activities of any sort, please join us. You don't have to organize a large international activity. Even if you just go look at the website or after this lecture and tell family or friends, hey, here's something I didn't know about. You're getting the word out. We're trying to reach as many people as possible. And you're always welcome to contact me if you have any questions. So with that, we've wrapped up. I don't know how much I've gone over my time. If I have, so I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for questions. So, oh yeah, I've used up my hour and a half, but as I said, I will stay on for as long as people want to ask questions.
Thank you, Dr. Veni. That was fantastic. I feel like I just had a graduate course in caves and karst, and I've got a whole list of things I have to go look up now and learn more about. We did have some comments in the chat, but do any viewers have something they would like to ask right now while we're visible?
And feel free to speak up, and and I can open up the chat myself and take a look if
okay. I'll let you do that.
Yeah, because I wasn't able to look at that when I was going through my presentation. So,
George, I'll often offer up a question that'll be at the end of the chat, and that is, how do you determine the drainage basin for a particular karst feature? Can you do it from surface drainage or landscape, or do you have to go underground and know what's going on?
One of the notorious difficulties with karst aquifers is that the surface drainage basin usually does not follow the groundwater drainage basin. For most aquifers, the two things coincide quite nicely. But think about the Edwards aquifer. It's a fantastic example of this, where you've got these streams, let's say west of San Antonio, that are flowing from north to south. The Nueces, the Medina, they're flowing from north to south. Meanwhile, the aquifer flows from west to east. And when you get into the Comal County area, the recharge is going from southwest to northeast, and the Guadalupe River flows perpendicular to that. It's just completely ignoring those boundaries. So the most effective way of delineating drainage basins in karst is through groundwater tracing, through dye tracing. Intuitively, it sounds easy. It's really a lot more complicated, and there's a lot of subtleties to make it happen. And there's a lot of challenges to make it happen. And I won't go into all the details. So it's not as easy as it sounds, but that's the best way. There are other methods as well that are used for many of the endangered species caves, where we're just trying to identify the drainage coming to a particular cave, and we're not trying to trace the aquifer below the cave. There are other methods that I've been using, including geophysics, what I call morphologic methods, looking at the size, the shape of the caves, the fractures, knowing how these features grow and form. And that's one of the key things. Understanding how they got there will tell us a huge amount about what's happening below the surface. So there's a comment here from Leon Dominic. Maybe the pollution in the Bowling Green karst was from the stingrays that fell from the Corvette Museum collapse several years ago. Actually, seriously, the work we did was well before that collapse, and the people who worked on that collapse were good friends of mine. But no, the problem with Bowling Green is that it's what's called the Central Kentucky karst. It's all karst. You have to go quite a ways to get off the karst. when I'm in communities like San Antonio, Austin, San Marcos, these others along the Balcones Escarpment, I've said this for years. You don't have to grow onto the karst. You don't have to expand the community onto the water supply, onto this vulnerable area. You can grow away from it. You know, there's nothing wrong with the south side of San Antonio. You know, it's beautiful land. It could be marketed quite well and efficiently. We don't have to grow northward. But there are parts of the country, many parts of the world, where you really don't have anywhere to go. Nearly all of Florida is karst, except for a tiny tip of the panhandle. So I'm not saying everyone in Florida needs to move on out. I am saying that be aware of what you have. I often use the analogy that when I get into my truck, I put on my seatbelt because I could get killed in my truck. But because I can get killed in my truck, if you didn't hear me the first time, I want that airbag to work. And I want the side bag and the top bag and the bottom bag, whatever airbags are there to protect me, because I can get killed in my truck. You want to go the extra distance when it comes to karst. There was a tragic situation. I often include this in many of my lectures up in Walkerton, Ontario in May of 2000, where there's a groundwater pollution incident there. No one was really at fault other than they didn't recognize how vulnerable this karst area was. They were not properly educated. As a result of the groundwater pollution, 7 people died and 2,300 people became ill. Many of them needed new kidneys and livers. I want to avoid things like this. So in the case of Bowling Green, there's no place for Bowling Green to go. It's in a very large area. And so we're not saying you can't develop, but you want as many of those proverbial airbags, as many of those safety margins as possible to minimize the chance of anything going wrong, of anything bad happening. And now let's see. Okay, Carolyn asks, it's not about New Mexico. It's about New Mexico, not Comal County. Am I aware of the Holtec high-level nuclear waste storage site near Carlsbad, Eunice, and Hobbs along the border of Eddy and Lee County? Is there any karst very near or under the site? Yes, I'm aware of that. I've had many questions about that. When I lived in San Antonio, I often said that if I could if the science said I could safely put a nuclear waste dump on karst, even though I might not want it in principle, I'd have to say, yeah, go for it, because the science says it's okay. The science says just the opposite. When I moved to Carlsbad, my wife was very upset because the only active permanent nuclear waste depository in the country, called the WIP site, and it's very low-level waste called transuranic waste, is just 20 miles outside of Carlsbad. And she says, damn it, George, we live here right next to a nuclear waste dump. And I said, remember what I said back about the Edwards? Well, the WIP site is actually okay. I'm not worried about the WIP site. You know, it's situated in a location where I feel a high degree of confidence that it will be okay. Now, the Holtec site is different. I feel somewhat similarly about it. There is some very deep limestone under the site, but from my understanding of it, it is not highly or at all karstified. So I'm not too concerned about it, but we haven't studied it in great detail at this point. And there are some debates, of course, about including it or not. One of the problems that you have with sites like this is that, you know, the stuff needs to go somewhere, and trying to be realistic and thinking about where most of this nuclear waste is at right now, those locations are a lot scarier, a lot more at risk than it would be at the Holtec site. I'm not saying Holtec is without risk. I'm not saying that transporting it is without risk. I am saying that based on my experience, where this material is currently stored is at much higher risk. And so nobody ever wants this stuff in their backyard. But But ultimately, the best place for this is an arid climate with low population density. And we have that there in Carlsbad or near Carlsbad. So far, I won't sign off to the site. I haven't studied in great detail, but I'm okay. So with it at this point. Next question. On the Honey Creek map, where is the start of Honey Creek at the surface level? Yeah, the creek itself is not shown, and that's somewhat deliberate, trying to protect the privacy of the landowner. Nowadays, with the internet, it doesn't take much effort to try to locate stuff. But yeah, Honey Creek Creek is at the east end of that, the right side of that map, and parts of the cave go under Guadalupe River State Park. None of it goes under under Honey Creek State Natural Area at this point, except maybe for that disconnected fragment that I mentioned that was severed by the creek. But as I've heard, it's been in the papers. Texas Parks and Wildlife is trying to negotiate with the landowner to actually buy that property that's up for development, and that's really one of the best ways to buy to protect land, is to buy it. You know, that's the way it's yours. Nobody can tell you what to do with it. It is yours there to protect. And the purchase of that land would then see most of the Honey Creek surface drainage area protected. So that would be an incredibly valuable thing to do. Now, the southwest end of that drainage area, as I understand, they're still planning to put a school there for all the growing housing that's occurring in there. But hopefully that will be a small enough impact, and hopefully they'll put in enough mitigation controls, you know, should any parking lot runoff and, you know, escape that site. So let's see, comment here. Great point on impervious cover, on how impervious cover is measured as a percent of individual development versus the overall drainage basin. Yeah, that's a point that's missed many times. The original study that this was based on, and there were a couple of studies that Tom Schuler did in the early 90s, but he was looking at surface water, not groundwater. And he found that there's an upper limit, and I don't remember the size right offhand, but there was an upper limit to the size of the surface drainage basin where his calculations, were less effective. I'd need to dig up that paper. And there's Helen's questions about drainage basin, yeah, and she asked, do you first have to understand what's going on underground? And definitely, and so that's where the dye tracing really comes into play. Note from Jack Oliver. I've heard George say, he says Dr. Veni, but I won't accept that from him. I've heard George say several times that the entire Edwards Aquifer recharge zone is sensitive. What do you think of the TCEQ's geologic assessment method for rating karst features based on their type of estimated relative infiltration rate? How good a job is Texas doing to protect the Edwards Aquifer from pollution? He's trying to put me on the spot and get me into trouble with some of my friends from TCEQ, who at least one of which I know is on the line, but that's okay. I was in the room in 1987 when the first standards were being proposed for doing geologic assessments. These were developed by the city of San Antonio. They were then expanded to the Texas Water Commission. It developed the TNRCC, now TCEQ, and they have evolved over time. I published a paper in 1999 where I looked at the earlier standards, not the current ones, but the earlier standards, because that's what was available at the time I did the study, that TNRCC at the time was using for protecting and evaluating recharge features. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to evaluate permeability. Permeability describes how easily water can move through a rock or soil. The more easily it can move, the higher the chance of contamination. And so I looked at 98 caves and karst features for an area that I studied in detail, where we, if it was, let's say, a sinkhole or some karst feature, we dug it down until we either got into a cave or got into a flat pan of rock or into a fracture or whatever. To try to develop a method, I wanted to develop a method that would predict, what I'm seeing, with what the actual permeability is. And so I applied those features to the old TNRCC methods, and basically they got it right about 34% of the time. Most of the time, underestimating the significance. I developed a method where I think I got it to like 77, 78% of the time correct. And then if you include like 5-10 minutes of digging to move away some soil and rock, I got it up to 90-something%. Now, like I say, that was based on the old method. One of the things I've longed to see, and I haven't had the chance to do it, is to take the current method that TCQ is using and apply that same method to it and see how the current standard ranks, in that scoring, in that methodology against those 98 features that I had evaluated. And I know that TCQ has been interested in wanting to continue to improve their methods. They've talked to me about it. They've talked to the Bureau of Economic Geology about it. I expect they've talked to many others about it. So certainly my hat's off to them for wanting to improve this. But because an evaluation hasn't been done, intuitively, I feel, being familiar with their method, the current method, that it is better than the old one that scored 34%. But is it 50%? Is it 60%, 70%? I don't know. So I can say it's better than it was. But beyond that, and again, that's just an unquantifiable, just estimate. But I can't be more specific than that. So let's see. Frank Rowe, George, when we spoke together about this, I discovered some years earlier that you were instrumental in helping convince Bear and San Antonio to take seriously recharge protections. Thank you. How'd you get that done in a few sentences? It was not just me. There were a lot of people working on this. Quite seriously, one of the things that happened, I think Gary Schendel was instrumental in many ways, and there are many other people. I don't want to just single out people, but when Gary's job with the Edwards Aquifer Authority, when the job was posted, I immediately sent it to Gary because his name was written all over the job description. And he calls me, he says, "George, you applying for this job?" I said, "Hell no, do you think I'd send it to you? If I'm gonna apply for the job, this thing was tailor-made for you." And so he came down, he talked to people, he interviewed for the job, but before he did, we had this is the first time I'm saying this publicly, but he's been working with them now 20-something years, and so it's probably okay. But I told him, I said, "Don't deny knowing me. You're a karst guy, you know me, but don't talk about how well we know each other. I've got political baggage. I'm trying to be a scientist, but because the science says that this area is environmentally sensitive, I'm seen as an environmentalist. So I've got political baggage. Don't talk about me. Certainly acknowledge if someone asks." And so when he first moved to town, some of my friends were saying, "George, aren't you upset that Gary's bringing in all these out-of-town experts? You know this area better than any of these other folks." And I said, "No, that's okay, because and Gary and I would joke about this. An expert is defined as someone who lives at least 50 miles outside of town. Obviously, you can't have an expert here in town. You've got to go somewhere else to find an expert." And so those were people who were recognized nationally and internationally And so they came in and they essentially validated much of what I'd been saying for years. They validated what Gary was proposing. And then suddenly, from being a guy with baggage, it was acceptable for me to do research for the Aquifer Authority. And so there were many, many different ways that these things happen. Part of my influence also, though, helped, because I did a lot of work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on endangered species. So I wasn't being hired initially to do aquifer work directly, but Fish and Wildlife recognized, what I had to do, my expertise, and that helped validate. But again, there were so many people. I see, for example, Annalisa Peace is on this call. Helen Ballou's on this call. There's many other people who were so instrumental in pushing things along, and it's just been slowly chipping away. When I was a student, I got my bachelor's degree at UTSA, a university built on a karst aquifer, and yet I had some of my professors, I had people at the old Edwards Underground Water District, people at the various state agencies, people at the U.S. Geological Survey, all tell me that the Edwards is not a karst aquifer. For a karst aquifer, you have to go to Kentucky. Where Mammoth Cave is at, the world's longest cave, that's karst. What we have here, yeah, we have caves, but it really isn't karst. And they really couldn't explain to me why it wasn't karst. Now we've come quite a long ways. So it's been a long, I've been at it now for 45 years. It's been a long journey. There's still more to do. I'm hoping with the International Year that we'll continue to educate. I'm hoping that this, and one of the reasons I mentioned UNESCO is that, yeah, granted, okay, I was in Paris talking to UNESCO. You guys weren't there. But in the work you do, you can say, look, caves and karst were welcomed to the floor at UNESCO. This global body recognized the importance of caves and karst. Why aren't you recognizing it? Shouldn't you join us? These cave people, they're not just a bunch of kooks. UNESCO, the UN is recognizing them. So use it to validate, to give credibility to the work that's being done, to recognize caves and karst and everything here. So anyway, I'm looking. Comment from Annalisa. Everyone pray that the Honey Creek deal goes through. It's not yet a done deal. I agree with that. And just a couple of thanks. And that's all the questions I'm seeing right now in the. Another. Brian Patrick, are you collecting the geophysical data as a time series, or is each survey line a different location? And Patrick, I wasn't able to attend your thesis defense last week because I was in the symposium. I got the invitation from Young Lee, and actually I was talking to Alan Clark about you today, so I'll be in touch separately. But no, it wasn't time series data. Time series data refers to you go into a location, you collect a sample, be it a water sample, a contaminant sample, an air sample, in this case a geophysical sample, and then you repeat it again and again and again in the same place and see how things change over time and with changes to the environment, with rainfall and so forth. So no, we didn't do time series, and yes, each survey line at Bracken was a different location. The work we're going to do in at the end of January will be we'll repeat the last line we did, but we're going to change the electrode spacing to see deeper into the cave. So there's a message from Helen. Will you repeat the point that the best way to protect karst aquifers is to protect the land that drains into it, both recharge and contributing zones? We will never be able to study the drainage basins of every karst feature associated with the Edwards, for example. So using your metaphor about airbags protecting as much land as possible is the safest bet. Yes, I agree with that. We can't protect every recharge feature, and that's the point of drainage basin protection and recognizing impervious cover limits. So we can have some confidence that there is some development. We can't stop everything. We may be able to fudge some of those impervious cover limits if we have strict guidelines on what sort of activities are, lend themselves to impervious cover. I mean, there's some that are more hazardous, more toxic, more polluting than others. So there may be some wiggle room there. But yes, you need to protect your recharge area. It's just that simple. And the idea that a clean aquifer is a paved recharge zone just doesn't work. Obviously, the more you cover up, the less water you have going into your water supply, and so with population growing, we need to maximize recharge, but we also need to maximize protection of it. And impervious cover has contamination issues. So Jane says, it seems to me that quarrying can open catchments that can increase for the possibility for aquifer contaminations. How can quarry operations be allowed to do that? During the field trip I led last week, Helen asked a similar question. And so I'll give you a similar answer. I really don't understand what's going on in the regulatory sense with quarries. And I'm not speaking for any regulatory agency, and this may be a matter of speaking from ignorance on my part. But over the years, it seems to me, watching from outside, that let's say someone comes into town and they say, I want to build a housing development. And they say, all right, here's this endangered species, aquifer, protection, state, federal agency you need to deal with. Someone wants to build a mall. Someone wants to build a road. They have to go through all these steps. Someone wants to build a quarry. I've never heard of any study being done on a quarry. Here's this big piece of land. We're going to, take this big hole out of it, cut a big hole into it. I've never heard of anything. I'm not saying there isn't. I just haven't heard of any. And I tend to get a hold of, because a lot of projects I work with, especially working with Fish and Wildlife and some other governmental projects, I get a lot of consulting reports. I've yet to see one from a quarry. So that's something that I've been concerned about for some time. I've wondered about for some time. And I have some related concerns or questions, really. One of which is runoff from the quarry. You have very fine powdery material that that can escape these things, that can actually plug up recharge features. I'm concerned about that. But more fundamentally, using the Danone Nobel spill outside of New Braunfels, the 2,600 gallons of diesel that spilled were there because diesel and ammonium nitrate are the common explosive used to blast open quarries. So nitrates in your water aren't good. Diesel fuel and all the byproducts are not good. So a question I've asked for many years, how much of the explosive is consumed, rendered inert in the explosion itself? And how much is left free where it can still enter the aquifer? I've never heard an answer to that. I don't know if anybody's researched it. A few years ago, well, this is maybe 20 years ago, I did an online search and wasn't able to find anything. Our search engines are much better now. Maybe something's been found. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but it's something I'm really curious about because that should be built in to whatever permit is provided for that area. So if you know that X amount of diesel and nitrate will go into your aquifer, and blasting out, a certain size area, then you can, then the regulator should be able to say, all right, this is the maximum you can do. Beyond that, you stop, or you use something else that doesn't produce these contaminants. And but like I say, I'm completely unaware. So let's see. Jack Oliver asked, how many dye tracing studies are being done over the aquifer recharge zone? Things, of course, like everything else, have slowed down with COVID. When I was down here, I did some tracing. Certainly, I showed the one case in north central Bexar County. We did some tracing in Kinney County around the springs, the Fort Clark Springs down in that area. Did quite a bit of tracing to the San Marcos Springs, and then I did a little bit of tracing around New Braunfels. The dye went from a cave to a well, and then we stopped there. Now and I can get back to that in just a moment. The EAA has continued doing some tracing. I know there's some of it in the Bear Comal area around Cibolo Creek. They tried to trace some of those flow paths, but didn't find the dye. And I'm not surprised, because in that area, trying to find the dye is going to be very difficult. I know they've done some other work in San Marcos, but because I haven't been here, I've been in New Mexico. I try to follow what's happening, but I can't speak to in any detail about that. I can say that there were also a lot of dye tracing in the Barton Springs segment of the aquifer, and in the South Austin area, and I mention that because there have been two different philosophies in this region about dye tracing. The dye trace I did for in Comal County that went from a cave to a well near New Braunfels, once we hit that well, it stopped. Because even though the dyes are non-toxic and all the stuff I mentioned before, people still get kind of weirded out. And I don't blame them if their water turns green or turns red or some other funny color. And so the EAA has taken a very cautious philosophy in doing their dye tracing. And so we calculate the amount of dye we inject based on the nearest likely detection points, be it a spring, or in this case, it was a well. If it shows up at that well, then the next trace will use even more dye, and that well will really get pummeled. And so we don't push that trace out further down into the aquifer. And so they're very conservative about that, because they don't want people getting upset with them. And that's a realistic philosophy, considering, I think, the political realities of the community that they're working with. Austin, they've taken a different approach. Of course, before you start any dye trace, you notify the community with newspapers, whatever you can do to notify people that this is going on. So in case somebody's well gets hit that you didn't anticipate, you know about it, and they know what's going on. They know it's really not a problem. But in Austin, they've taken the tactic of, we're pouring a whole bunch of dye down the aquifer, and then if it hits somebody's well, their response is, "Aren't you glad that's not gasoline? Now we know where your water's coming from." And so now we can protect that area of the recharge zone, and we didn't know it was coming here. So, and philosophically, politically, that plays better and works better in the Austin area. So there are different philosophies. Now, the EAA could potentially continue doing these dye, that dye trace that I did, but then they'd have to put a water filtration unit on that well and have that running for weeks or months, during the time of the dye trace. And those things are expensive. So they're looking at other places where we might be able to do some dye injections and hopefully hit monitoring wells, not drinking water wells. So that's what's going on there. Let's see. Dara wrote interesting article from the San Antonio Express News on quarries. So I'll have to get back and open that up. Helen said she might lose power in a minute, so just says thanks. Anyway, I'm not going to she's gushing. I'm not going to gush.
She's gushing, and I think I ought to thank you now for the whole group, George. It has been so generous. You've been so generous with your time and your knowledge, and I appreciate it so much. I don't know if you've been watching the number of people that were here, but we had a total of 51 sign on originally, and 35 of them stuck through the whole thing. We're losing a few now, and I think 8 o'clock is a good quitting time. Thank you again. We appreciate this so much, and keep doing what you're doing, because we all are benefiting from it.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a community effort. I mean, one person doesn't do it. It's a community effort to make these things happen. So, a few of you, don't hesitate to contact me already. And I know the area. I'm happy to help if I can. So let me know if you need anything.
Thank you. We hope you'll come back and talk with us again.
Just let me know.
Have a good evening and a safe trip back home.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thanks for joining.